Motor replacement on a 3SF oven. This is the oven viewed from the rear. The two drive motors are at the rear underneath. In this video we will remove the motors and replace them with new ones. Before moving the oven forward, drain the oven floor and drain the fat separator. Then you can move the oven forward and isolate the power supply. These components will need to be removed prior to replacing the motors. This plumbing line completely, the blue fat bucket, the fat bucket holder bracket, the electrical panel, the center panel, and this rear vent. This is the motor coupling. This connects the oven shaft that goes all the way to the roof of the oven to the drive motor beneath it. Alignment between the shaft and the motor is absolutely critical. It is set up at the factory, and providing we follow the following procedure, that should remain true. If not, we have another video to do coupling alignments. Step 1 is to put a pair of vice grips on the smooth nut. Using a 13mm spanner, release the locking nut above it. At no time do we ever release the grub screws and the nuts here. This half of the coupling is centered to the shaft, and if you disrupt these nuts and grub screws here, the alignment procedure will be necessary. The alignment procedure is quite detailed and covered in a different video. The smooth nut should be only finger tight on the O-ring. It is also threaded all the way through. As we can see here, it is concave and accepts the O-ring when it's fitted together. The same goes for the shaft coupling side. It's actually grooved to accept the other side of the O-ring. At no time is the smooth nut ever clamped down hard onto the O-ring. It should only ever be down finger tight at tightest. Remove all three of the smooth nut and locking nut assemblies. Now that all three smooth nut, O-ring and locking nut assemblies have been removed, we can now go underneath the oven and release the motor. Cut the cable ties and unravel the wiring. If you have the opportunity before tending site, it is good to bend a 13mm spanner like this. This will make it much easier to access the motor nuts. This is not necessary, but it does make the job easier. This is just a square block of foam approximately 270mm long. We place this underneath the motor so that when we loosen the motor bolts, the motor is still held in position. Then the piece of foam can be removed and the motor can be lowered. Using a 13mm spanner, we can loosen off the 4 nuts that hold the motor in position. We can take these off completely until the motor rests on the foam block. The nuts above this in here are never to be touched. They are set to a preset height from the factory. If you move the nuts above the motor, the whole system will need to be reset. Now that the 4 motor nuts have been removed and all the coupling has been undone, the motor can drop down and sit on top of your foam packer. It's easy enough now to lift the motor up get the foam packer out of the road and remove the motor. If you are replacing the motor, cut the wire here. Tape the new wire from the new motor to the cable, and you can use the old cable as a draw wire to run the cable back through over to the switchboard. This is the right hand side contactor for the fan motor. This is its thermal overload. So when we draw the wiring through the bottom of the oven using the old wire as a draw wire, this is a point where we re-terminate it. Remembering that rotation is phase sensitive and the rotation direction must be checked before starting the oven. These are the motor mounting studs. Preset from the factory is a nut and a locking nut. At no point are these ever to be adjusted. Before fitting the motor up into position, it is important to make sure that the 3 O-rings are on this side of the coupling. There is a small spherical bearing in the centre of the coupling. This lines up with the pin in the bottom of the oven shaft. It is important to make sure that this is nice and level and straight prior to trying to fit the motor. Lift the motor into position. It's handy to have your block of foam spacer ready to go underneath the motor to keep it there once you have it in position. With the motor reinstalled back into position, we can reinstate the top O-ring and the smooth nut O-ring cup side down. For ease of demonstration, we will do this next part on the bench with a coupling that is removed from the oven. It is important to wind down the smooth nut until it just touches the O-rings. Back it off a quarter of a turn, put your locking nut on, use a pair of vice grips to hold the smooth nut, and using a 13mm spanner, lock the locking nut. Do this for all 3 of the studs. What this ensures is that we get a little bit of float and movement between the O-ring surfaces. This will allow for the very smallest amount of misalignment between the oven shaft and the motor shaft. Using the old wire as a draw wire, we can draw the wire through and re-terminate it to the thermal overload. Refit the rear vent panel and the rear panel. Leave the electrical cover off so we can do a rotation test. Move the oven back into position and reconnect the floor plumbing to the drain. If it is safe to do so, push the oven back into position and start the computer, remembering that the rear electrical panel has not been fitted yet and the wiring is exposed. This is the left-hand side chamber. It is rotating clockwise, looking from the top down. Another way to think about this is the oven chambers rotate from the centre out. The left-hand side turns the opposite direction to the right-hand side. On the back panel of the oven is the rotation decal. This shows direction of the chicken racks in their rotation, not the direction of the fan shafts. It is very important that the ovens rotate in the correct direction. If they turn in the incorrect direction, it may cause damage to the oven. If the chicken rack rotates back to front, swap any of the 2 phase wires over to correct this. With all the direction checks and safety checks finished, we can put the back panel onto the oven.